Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yadi Madad. Let me begin by wishing all viewers Navroz Mubarak. May it bring much joy, barakah and peace for all of us. As you know, Navroz is usually associated with renewal, rebirth and new beginnings. So this year its symbolism is particularly relevant for us. After one of the most dreadful years in our collective lives, we have the hope of returning to some semblance of normality in the coming months. And in that sense, it is an opportunity for new beginnings. Every year, Navroz marks the first day of spring in the Northern Hemisphere. On this day, called the spring vernal equinox, the Earth reaches a point in its orbit where the sun is directly above the equator, making the duration of the day and night nearly equal. I suspect that for most of us, the alignment of celestial spheres really doesn't mean much. But we do look forward to warmer temperatures, the blooming of colorful flowers, and hearing birds chirping. Perhaps that is why the arrival of spring has been celebrated across many cultures with special rites and festivities. You know, festivals in general are times to come together as a family and to reaffirm the sense of community. They present opportunities to celebrate our cultural, religious, and national identity through many different expressions. And they offer respite from the everyday grind of life. In that sense, each festival is an extraordinary day, providing an opportunity to detach oneself from the everyday humdrum of life and to rejoice. It is said that in ancient Roman times, nearly 100 days in a year were designated as festival or feast days, when people took a break from their routine activities to celebrate holy occasions. The rest of the days were referred to as vacant days, during which people would do their normal work. You know, the term vacation that we use comes from this notion of vacant days, except that we now use it in exactly the opposite sense. In any case, according to a report from the United Nations, more than 300 million people celebrate Navroz across different regions, including Iran, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It is fascinating, I think, that a pre-Islamic festival, usually associated with the Zoroastrians, came to be adopted and celebrated by so many Muslims, both Shia and Sunni. By the way, did you know that the Bektashi Sufis in Turkey also celebrate Navroz, but not as the beginning of a new year? They consider it to be the birth anniversary of their first spiritual master, Imam Ali. Also in Syria, the day of Navroz coincides with Mother's Day. In the history of our Jamaat, Navroz celebrations date back to the Fatimid period, when the Coptic Christian New Year, also called Navroz, was adopted by the Fatimid Imam Caliphs as an official festival. But based on the manner of its celebrations, historians believe that this Navroz was indeed inspired by the Persian Navroz. Later, when our Imams lived in Persia, the more traditional Navroz, as the Persian New Year, became part of the Ismaili tradition as well. There is an important idea here that I want to bring forward, and this relates to the relationship between religion and culture. You see, no religion is practiced in a vacuum. Everyone practices their religion in a cultural context. So inevitably, there is a strong cultural influence on our understanding and practice of faith. Those of us who are from South Asia, for instance, will immediately recognize the Indian languages and gestures that have become so much a part of our tariqah practices. Navroz is also a classic example of a cultural festival that has been appropriated into our tradition. This relationship between culture and religion is so intertwined that it can sometimes be quite difficult to separate the two. Let me tell you a story from history to illustrate what I mean. Historians have recorded that in the year 777, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi visited Medina and went to the mosque where the Prophet had been buried 145 years earlier. Al-Mahdi was pleased to see that the wooden pulpit from which the Prophet had delivered the Friday sermons was still standing. But he was dismayed to discover that an earlier caliph had transformed the pulpit to make it look more grand and more magnificent. He ordered his carpenter to remove the additions, to restore the pulpit to its original simplicity. But when they examined the structure more closely, they discovered that the earlier caliph's iron nails had been driven deep into the structure to sustain it, and pulling them out would risk destroying the entire edifice. So Al-Mahdi left the pulpit untouched. You see, it is the same with Islam. Over the centuries, Muslims in different times and cultures have understood and interpreted Islam in their own ways, adding their interpretations and ritual forms to give expression to the Prophet's teachings. This is what has given rise to the diversity amongst Muslims. This is also why there is a diversity of Ismaili traditions of practice. And this diversity is seen as natural and positive. You know, one way to think about this is to think of religion like a river. The river flows over different terrains and picks up the flora and fauna of that terrain over which it flows. The water remains the same, but it now carries with it traces of the terrain over which it has passed. Similarly, religions are practiced across different cultural terrains, picking up the diverse expressions in different times and climes. This is not to suggest that there is a pure form of religion in the beginning, and then it absorbs new things over time. The confluence of culture and religion was even true at the time of the Prophet, when 7th century Arab customs and practices called urf were absorbed as part of the early teachings of Islam. The point is that understanding the interaction of culture and religion is very important. This is perhaps the reason why Maulana Hazar Imam has devoted so much time and effort in this arena, particularly through the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. For instance, in his speech delivered in London at the IIS's 25th anniversary graduation ceremony, Maulana Hazar Imam said that one of the objectives of establishing the Aga Khan Museum was to disseminate information and education about Islam's vast and varied heritage and its interface with the many cultures in which it has evolved. In some ways, Navroz is also a celebration of diversity that emerges from the confluence of religion and culture. Indeed, we join many other communities amongst Muslims as well as Zoroastrians and others in celebrating Navroz. Our forms of celebration are different. Even the meanings we associate with Navroz may be different, but they are all linked to the same idea of rebirth, renewal, new beginnings. Speaking of new beginnings, this Navroz is a good time to think about how the new normal, once all the restrictions are lifted, will be different. I mean, surely we cannot just go back to doing everything the way we used to before the pandemic. Amongst other important realizations, I hope that most of us have recognized that our collective actions in the past have had a huge impact on the environment. Did you notice the difference in the air, particularly during the early days of the pandemic when lockdowns were fully in effect? The air felt cleaner. There was no haze over the horizon. We saw and heard many more birds around us. So perhaps one of the resolutions of this Navroz can be that we will be much more conscious of the impact of our lifestyles, our attitudes, for a more eco-friendly future. Another important learning from the experience of last year must be the impact of the inequities and systemic inequalities in our societies. We realized that the disadvantaged poor have been hit the hardest during this pandemic. While many of us worried about when we might get our next haircut, for many others, their concern was how they will provide the next meal for their families. it is important for us to realize that there are systematic and unjust differences in health and well-being between different groups of people, which we can all help to alleviate. The social class in which we are born and the conditions in which we live and work, they influence our opportunities for good health, good education, as well as how we think, how we feel, how we act. They shape our physical and mental health. They influence our exposure and vulnerability to diseases, as well as our ability to manage their consequences. So perhaps another resolution that we might make on this Navroz is to be more conscious of the needs and suffering of others, doing all we can to address inequalities and to help improve the quality of life of those in need. One of the consequences of the pandemic-related restrictions has been our inability to come together in Jamaat Khanas. Many of us took that privilege for granted. It is only when we were unable to do so did many realize how important a part the Jamaat Khana has played in our lives, not just in terms of facilitating congregational prayers, but also how it enabled us to enact our ethic of service, to sustain our friendships, and strengthen the unity of the Jamaat. So could it also be one of our Navroz resolutions to be more regular in our attendance of Jamaat Khana and getting more engaged with voluntary services? Surely that is something that will be pleasing to Maulana Hazar Imam as well. So as we celebrate Navroz, we can look forward to a better and more hopeful future. Inshallah, the spirit of renewal that Navroz represents will be manifested in both the material and spiritual aspects of our lives in the forthcoming year. Thank you for listening to this talk, and once again, Navroz Mubarak to you all. Ya Ali Madad.